your car. So get into Midas now for the brake you need. $89.95 for brakes. Midas Brake Service. It's worth stopping for.
Back by popular demand, the RV liquidation sale at the Nut Tree, August 7th through 16th. All new 97s and used RVs being liquidated. That includes motorhomes, fifth wheels, wide bodies, trailers, slide outs, and diesel pushers. Register to win $2,000. Guaranteed winner. The RV liquidation.
Today on Face the Nation, the day before the day that Bill Clinton goes before the grand jury. Washington woke up to this headline in its hometown newspaper. The president's lawyers believe he has decided to change his story about Monica Lewinsky. What if he does? Would that make impeachment hearings more or less likely? We'll ask Florida Congressman Bill McCollum, a key member of the committee responsible for such hearings. Democratic Party Chairman Roy Romer, governor of Colorado, and San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown. Then we'll try to add perspective and gauge the impact of all this on future presidencies, as we hear from historian Michael Beschloss, former federal judge Robert Bork, and Lloyd Cutler, longtime advisor to Democratic presidents. The agony of Bill Clinton on Face the Nation.
Face the Nation with Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And now from CBS News in Washington, Bob Schieffer.
Good morning again. We begin this morning from Orlando, Florida, where Congressman Bill McCollum, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, is standing by. With us from San Francisco, the mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, and here in the studio, Colorado Governor Roy Romer, also chairman of the Democratic Party. I want to begin with Congressman McCollum as a member of the Judiciary Committee. CBS News has it from two sources. The New York Times has it from two sources. The Associated Press has it from three sources. The Washington Post now with the story this morning that whatever he does in the end, it seems pretty clear the president's friends are putting out the story that he is thinking about changing his story about Monica Lewinsky, a woman he has denied having a relationship with. Congressman McCollum, if he does change his story, does that make impeachment more or less likely?
Well, I think this has to be put in context. Context, first of all, that almost everyone I know does not want to see the President of the United States impeached, if at all possible. We all think that that's a bad thing to have happen, and we hope that when the sun sets on Ken Starr's investigation, he goes before the television microphones and says, I don't have a case, I don't have a report to send up to Congress. But assuming that one is sent up there, then the responsibility of reviewing all of this is going to be incumbent upon members of the judiciary. And none of us on the Judiciary Committee of either party want to prejudge what's coming up there. So with that in context, I will only make this comment about that, Bob, and that is that the issue about whether the president told the truth or not in front of a judicial proceeding in a deposition in a civil case, whether he lied, is very, very important. It's serious, as well as whether or not he encouraged others to lie or whether there was obstruction of justice. And if, in fact, at the end of the day, after all of that might be reviewed by Judiciary Committee members and a recommendation has to be made to the full House about impeachment, those of us sitting on Judiciary conclude that indeed he did not tell the truth under oath in a court proceeding or encouraged others not to tell the truth or in some other way obstructed justice. It would seem to me it would be very difficult not to vote to encourage and recommend impeachment under those conditions, no matter what the president may say in front of national television or in the grand jury. But I have no idea what he's going to say, and I have no idea the context in which that might come up to us when we get it on our table, if we get it, in a few weeks.
So, Senator Orrin Hatch, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which of course would not be involved in impeachment hearings, has said repeatedly that it was his belief that if the president sort of fessed up and came clean with all of this, that it was his belief that the American people would forgive him and that Congress would sort of let this go. But if I heard what you were saying today as a member of the Judiciary Committee, if the president has obstructed justice, if he has lied under oath in a judicial proceeding, you would have to vote for impeachment.
The president is the highest judicial officer, if you will, the highest officer in law enforcement of the United States. I don't think he can be held to any less standard than we hold somebody else who's committed a crime, and perjury is a crime. So I would find, if in fact, and that's of course a big if, there is indeed in the context of everything else we get, and I'm not judging this up to this point, I'm not judging it at all until the Judiciary Committee, if the Judiciary Committee gets all the matters and has hearings and everything else. But if, at the end of the day, I concluded that the President of the United States lied under oath in a judicial court proceeding, I would have a very hard time not voting to recommend impeachment to the House. And let me also say, Bob, that this is a several-stage process.
Okay.
And other members might disagree, but we'd be making a recommendation. The House would be voting on it if it came to that. And ultimately, it's somewhat like a trial in the Senate. It would be a trial. Somebody else will make that decision ultimately what happens to the president.
All right, let me go to our other guests. Well, Governor Romer, I guess I'd better go to you for reaction to what the congressman just said.
You know, I find it's something's wrong that we got here. The people I know in this country are saying enough is enough. You know, they started out, you know, on Whitewater, spent $40 million 4 years, and now we're talking about the private life of a president. I just don't think the private life of a president ought to be grounds for impeachment. And I think the American people don't feel this. I think they want it behind them. They want us to let this president be president. I just feel he's going to speak tomorrow. We ought to just wait until he speaks and then react and come to our conclusion. But the final thing is we ought to get this done, get it off the table, get it behind us, and get back to what really counts.
Let me just make sure I understand what you say. He speaks tomorrow. Do you mean he's going before the grand jury, or do you know that he's going to talk to the American people?
No, he speaks to the grand jury tomorrow.
Do you think he ought to, or does he owe the American people some explanation after he talks to the grand jury?
No, I think that he will communicate, obviously, to the American people in some way about this. I have no inside knowledge, but a president...
Should he, in your view, should he talk to the American people about this?
I think I would leave that to him. Look, I think it's a very unusual circumstance. I have a special prosecutor who is as zealous as this, go after you for 4 years and $40 million. I think he's got to be very cautious about what he says and when he says it, so I'd leave it to his judgment.
All right. Mayor Brown, do you think that the president owes the American people an explanation regardless of what he tells the grand jury tomorrow?
I think I share the governor's view, and that is that the president has to be very careful about what he says, when he says it, and where he says it. This particular prosecutor has gone beyond reality as it relates to dealing with any issues, any assumed issues, and I think it's highly wrong to put the president in a position where speculation becomes the fuel that continues this investigation. I think he should go before the grand jury. I would prefer, frankly, to have him go before the grand jury with the entire American people watching, and let's get away from this sexual inquisition which Kenneth Starr has orchestrated.
Well, what about what Congressman McCollum said earlier, that if he has indeed lied under oath, then that is a very serious offense, regardless of his personal life and so forth. But the fact that he did go before a judicial proceeding, give a deposition, and say one thing, if he now changes that story, won't that be a serious thing?
Bob, lying is always a serious matter, but let's put things in perspective. There should be no speculation about what might be or could be or what have you. Why don't we await the president's appearance, the president's testimony, and not have it spun out and leaked out in the process and way in which Mr. Starr is accused of doing that, and then we'll be in a position to comment. To do anything more than that, I think, is simply to fuel the flames without any real foundation.
Well, you know, Mr. Mayor, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, this does not come out of just out of thin air, these reports that the president's advisors are debating whether or not he ought to say this or whether or not he ought to say that. These are stories that are coming from his friends, people that wish him well. Do you think that, in a sense, he could deny having sexual relations with this young woman by defining certain, I guess the best word I could use is sex play, as not constituting sexual relations? Will that play with the American people, with voters in San Francisco?
I don't think it matters one way or another. This is the private matter involving Bill Clinton and some person who says that there was something going on. I think the American people have already made up their minds. Some of them think he did, and some of them think he did not. And I don't think in either case anyone cares. What people care about is whether or not family leave continues, whether or not the process of doing child care continues, safety on the street continues. I think the people do care seriously about whether or not there was any efforts to block anybody else from telling the truth before a grand jury under oath or any other judicial proceedings.
All right.
The only question Kenneth Starr ought to ask is, President Clinton, did you do the following? Did you tell someone to go before a grand jury and lie? No, I did not. Did you tell anybody to conceal this from a grand jury or any other appropriate judicial proceedings? No, I did not. If there's no evidence that he did that, this matter ought to be over. What he did in his private life is his problem to be dealt with his wife.
Let me go back quickly to Congressman McCollum. You have heard what both Mr. Brown and Roy Romer have just said. And the fact is, the polls do show that people are very, very tired of this. They still give the president a high approval rating. Is there a chance that if the president does come on and fess up, in the words of Orrin Hatch, that, and if the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee decide to go ahead with hearings of some sort, isn't there a possibility that this could blow up in your face and backfire in some way?
Well, I'm very tired of this, too, and as I said earlier, I don't want to see the president impeached any more than anybody else does. I don't think that's good for the country. I do believe that this is not a matter about sex. I don't believe it's about his personal life, and I don't believe he should be impeached for that. I think if anything comes of this, and I hope it does not, and we have to make that decision later, after we see what comes up, if anything comes up from Ken Starr's report, and any witnesses and any investigation that may take us several weeks to do. But if it comes up, I'd like to be able to report to the full House, no, we don't have anything here. But let me say again, I don't think we should diminish the fact that while there may be a background of sex or whatever in this, the issue is, did the President of the United States lie under oath in a court proceeding? That is a perjury, that is a criminal offense, that's very serious. Did he get somebody else to lie? Did he do anything else to obstruct justice? I don't know. But if any of those things were to be shown ultimately to the House Judiciary Committee members, I think that whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you'd have a hard time not referring that on to the House. Now, what comes of it in the end, whether or not the president's removed from office, whether the House votes that way, those are all different kinds of considerations. But we have an obligation as Judiciary Committee members to look at the facts as they're presented to us, not what we've heard on television or somewhere else.
All right,
Congressman,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to all of you. We simply have to end it at this point. We'll be back to talk about some of the legal and historical perspectives on all of this in just a moment. In a minute. Former Clinton White House counsel and a longtime advisor to Democratic presidents, Lloyd Cutler. Here in our studio, Judge Robert Bork and historian Michael Beschloss. Mr. Beschloss, put this in some perspective. You are not only a historian, you are an observer of the Washington scene. We have had this series of stories coming out of the White House this week about how the president may indeed be going to change his story. An extraordinary story in the Washington Post today, in my view, in that the president's friends are saying that perhaps one of the things the president has to do if he does change his story is somehow smooth this over with his wife and prepare his wife and daughter for what's about to come. Is that the purpose? I mean, I am a believer that all leaks to the newspapers are there because somebody wants the news out. Is this story this morning an attempt to tell the president's wife what's going on here?
You can't exclude that as a possibility, Bob. And that would be a rather unusual thing. You know, usually we historians and also biographers only find out sometimes 20 or 30 years later what goes on between a president and first lady. And, you know, of all the things around a president that are perhaps the hardest to really find out about, usually presidents and first ladies don't write to each other very much. They usually don't send memos, except for the case of Richard Nixon and Pat Nixon. They often sent memos back and forth between each other and communicated that way. But this would be an amazing thing if this is an effort by the president essentially to communicate with his wife about this most private matter in the newspapers.
Judge Bork, you're a lawyer. Tell us about grand juries. When the president goes before this grand jury, does he have to answer every question that he's asked?
Doesn't have to. He can do one of two things. He can take the Fifth Amendment, or he can refuse to answer, in which case I assume that Judge Starr would then subpoena him again. They're not testifying in a subpoena now, but if he doesn't live up to his agreement, Starr will subpoena him.
Well, we have been told before that it is really not politically feasible for a president to take the Fifth Amendment, a right that all citizens have, but that it just sort of in a political sense, that wouldn't work for a president. Can he just simply say, though, acknowledge part of this and say the rest of it's private and a personal matter and I'm just not going to tell you about it?
He can say that, but I think he is then setting up a constitutional confrontation, because if he walks out and Starr subpoenas him, then the question becomes whether he can be subpoenaed on the theory that it may lead to an indictment. And we may litigate this thing for another year up to the Supreme Court. A prospect which should cheer nobody up. But I assume Starr would not let him get away with that.
That he would press him on that.
Yeah.
Lloyd Cutler, you've been a White House counsel to this president. You've been a long-time advisor to presidents as long as I can remember. What kind of a situation are we in here? How do you see this resolving itself?
Well, let me say first that this president has been one punch away from a knockout a number of times, and he always came back much stronger in the end. And I think that's going to happen this time. I don't think it's likely that he will be indicted. I don't think it's legally permissible under the Constitution to indict a sitting president. And it would certainly be most unwise, even for a special prosecutor, because imagine the country for the next 2 years with a president under indictment and all of the things the president has to do. As for impeachment, I doubt that it's ever going to go beyond the House committee, and impeachment is limited to treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which certainly means that if you're going to impeach a president, you have to have something approaching treason or bribery in his official conduct.
Mr. Cutler, no one respects your opinion more than I, and I think you know that. But when you say the president's going to come away from this stronger than ever, you're going to have to explain that to me.
I didn't say he was going to come away stronger than ever. I'm saying I don't think he's going to be indicted, and I don't think he's going to be impeached.
Where do you see
I'm
this
sure
going,
he wishes
Michael
he'd
Beschloss?
never met Monica Lewinsky.
I'm sorry, I mean to jump in on what you were saying. If I overrode Mr. Cutler, he said, I'm sure he's sorry he ever met Monica Lewinsky. But Michael Beschloss, as a historian, where do you put this? And
If we're talking about impeachment, there have been only really 4 times in American history where impeachment was mentioned, even in a rather unserious way. Andrew Johnson, obviously, 1868, was nearly convicted and thrown from office. And then Richard Nixon in 1974. Ronald Reagan, briefly during Iran-Contra, impeachment was raised as a possibility, and now the 4th time. And the amazing thing here is that the 3 latter cases of possible impeachment that I'm talking about have all occurred within the last 25 years. So one thing I think we have to conclude is that because that is within the memories of most of us now living, we're beginning to think of impeachment as something of a more possible aspect of any presidency than we did during most of American history, and that weakens the office.
You heard Mr. Cutler say that he did not believe it legally permissible to indict a president. You agree with that, Judge Borton?
I wrote an opinion to that effect back in the Nixon administration, and I don't believe so, but it's not settled by any means. What I was saying before was that if Kenneth Starr tried to subpoena the president again to make him answer questions he hasn't answered, the president may say the only validity of a subpoena is to lead to an indictment, and since you may not indict me, the subpoena's no good, in which case we would litigate that.
How do both of you feel about the fact that what if the president changed his story? Orrin Hatch, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, says if he fesses up, he thinks the American people will forgive him. Bill McCollum, a member of the Judiciary Committee, just said, look, if he's lied under oath in a judicial proceeding, I would have to vote for impeachment. How do you think it'll play out there, Judge?
I think that is an impeachable offense. I also think that probably the Congress hasn't got the stomach to impeach as long as the president's approval ratings remain high. I think the Republicans won't do it. Should they do it? I think it is an impeachable offense.
But you don't think they will. Michael?
You know, there seems to be a little bit of a canard that presidents have lied a lot of times in history to the American people, and it really has not happened very often. It's sometimes mentioned Dwight Eisenhower about the sending of a U-2 spy plane into the Soviet Union, said he didn't do it untruthfully. At that time, there was an enormous effort by the people around Eisenhower, for instance, to say it is absolutely cardinally important that the president never be allowed to say something to the American people that later on is clear to be false. Any deceptions that are put out to cover this intelligence operation should be done by lesser officials. And they went to the extent of actually getting the Secretary of State, Christian Herter, to deny presidential involvement before the Senate, he probably could have been convicted for perjury for that. But the point is that in the past, usually there's an effort to make sure that a president does not say something that can later be proved false. Nixon is the big exception.
Mr. Cutler, would you advise the president to give some explanation to the American people, and do you feel he owes the American people some explanation?
Well, the president has very good private counsel, and he has a very good White House counsel. I'm not privy to any of the preparations or discussions, but I would certainly think he's going to tell the truth as he recalls it. The whole arrangement for his testimony, it seems to me, is entirely inconsistent with any notion that he would plead the Fifth or concoct a new story. And I'm content just to leave it at that. I think what's much more serious is that in the process of the independent counsel's efforts in this case, we have taken away or seriously threatened a number of the president's real prerogatives. The prerogative of having advice from his government counsel that doesn't have to be disclosed. The prerogative of having the Secret Service people who watch him not required to testify about what they see or hear in his intimate conversations with his own friends and family. We're losing that. Who is going to write a memorandum today or give frank advice to the president if there's any concern that it has to be disclosed to a grand jury at the behest of a prosecutor?
You know, those were not prerogatives. They did not exist. President Clinton tried to press them, tried to make them into prerogatives, and the courts rebuffed him.
But you do not disagree, do you, Judge, that this will have an impact on future presidencies?
Well, I suppose so. You know, in a way, this demystifies the presidency, and I'm not at all sure that that isn't a good thing.
All right. We have to let it go there.
Can I just add one thing, Bob? That is whether or not there's a legal decision upholding these privileges. They've been recognized for 200 years.
All right. We have to end it there. Back with a final word in just a minute. When he told Playboy magazine that on occasion he had lust in his heart. He stressed he had never acted on this impulse, but since the Bible told him it was sinful, he said he regretted it. Democrats cringed, Republicans hooted. I can still remember a one-time governor from the Old South bringing a crowd to its feet as he thundered, "They say tell it all, but I don't believe I'd have told that." Well, it all died down, and Carter went on to win the presidency, of course, but how quaint it all seems now. A little lust in the heart is pretty tame stuff in this summer of Monica Lewinsky. Just the other day, when I called the CBS News desk to see what was going on, a colleague I've known for years joked that she wasn't sure she knew me well enough to discuss what was on the front page of the New York Times, an account of how the president's advisors were debating whether a certain kind of sex play qualified as sexual relations. That's what has always set this story apart. It only gets worse. I have no idea what the president plans to tell the grand jury or what, if anything, he intends to tell the rest of us. But whatever he says, let's hope it's enough to bring this story to some kind of conclusion, because frankly, I've heard about enough. That's our broadcast. Thanks for watching.
Today's guests and topics. It originated in Washington, D.C.